Yeah, I think we can slowly start. The webinar is being recorded, so everyone who is joining late can always go back later next week and check the recording. Probably in the big, yeah, I will not obviously dive into the standards right away. So hello everyone, and thank you for joining our technical webinar on changes in the revised standards or standards version 2. I'm happy to see so many people joining this session today. Yesterday, we already had the same webinar for American time zone, and today we cover Europe and Asia. So same content, but different time zone. My name is Roman Polechenko. I'm the assurance manager at SBP. I would like to give you a detailed overview of key changes in standard version 2 compared to version 1. My colleagues Nicholas and Laszlo, they are also attending this webinar. They will help me with a Q&A session at the end. So Nicholas, say hello.
All right. Hello everyone. Thank you very much for joining today's sessions. I hope you'll find it instructive, insightful. We'll invite you, of course, to share any question you might have using the Q&A function that you will find on the top ribbon of your screens, share all our insights, and I wish you a very good training sessions.
Yeah, thanks, Nicholas. So before we start, let's check some brief housekeeping items. You should be familiar with them if you already participated in our launch webinar in May. So this webinar is being recorded. It will be made available next week on our YouTube channel. You will receive us an email with a direct link. You cannot search for these videos just through YouTube website, but you need to have a specific link. So note that cameras and microphones are disabled during the webinar, and you should use, as Nicholas just explained, Q&A section to submit your questions, and you can do it during the presentation. Once you have, you see the slide, you have some question, just type it into the Q&A, and after approximately 1 hour of session, we will have a 10 minutes break, and after that, I will try to answer all your questions. I think yesterday someone told that this Q&A section may not work immediately, so you may need to click on it several times to open it. I don't know, it worked well for me, for other people it didn't work, so they had to use a chat section, which you can also use in case you face troubles with the Q&A, but we prefer Q&A. It will help us to collect questions later, so just click a few times if it doesn't work. So to start, the objective of today's session is to provide a semi-detailed presentation of key changes and other relevant technical aspects. Why I say semi-detailed is because the full detailed webinars are already available online on our YouTube channel, and today we will only focus on the key changes. So we didn't see the need to schedule half a day with you to go through all the requirements, because some of the contents of the revised standards are quite straightforward, and you can study it in your own time separately. So here we will give you a really key update on some highlights on the revised requirements. We will also give you some detailed recommendations for the transition process, including when it's practical to start using new standards and what could be the consequences of delaying this transition. And as I said, after approximately 1 hour, 10 minutes, let's see how it goes. We will have a break, and then we will go into the Q&A session. So what are the key changes worth explaining today? While the structural changes were important, shuffling around sections of the standard, making it more readable, improving the actual sustainability requirements in line with the new scientific evidence, regulatory requirements, and stakeholder expectations was the main objective of the standard review. So in the following slides, I will give you an overview of the changes with the focus on the substantial changes. Let's spend a few moments looking at the normative framework. So we have SBP Standard 1 and 2, which deal with the feedstock. The Standard 1 defines feedstock compliance requirements. Standard 2 defines feedstock verification process. Standard 3 is about certification process and is used by certification bodies. Standard 4 is traceability and chain of custody. Standard 5 is collecting and communication data. And Standard 6 deals with the greenhouse gas calculations of emissions. Glossary of terms and definitions explains key terms used in the standards. And we also have several instruction documents, benchmarking reports, regional risk assessments, and the bridging ID for RED 2. So we will explain how these things work with the standards. Besides normative documents, we also have guidance and process documents. So this slide obviously only highlights some major documents and doesn't include all of them. Otherwise, the slide will be very busy. But during the presentation, I will try to mention all different requirements, different documents which we have for each of the standards. So next, I will cover 6 standards and will highlight the key changes which may need specific explanation and require additional effort with the implementation. So the standard 1 is designed to be used as a reference for biomass sector in consistently defining and managing sourcing risks and driving continuous improvement. It covers the most relevant sustainability aspects of feedstock production, including social, environmental, legal, and carbon stock requirements. So the certification scheme still applies a risk-based approach, and the biomass producers assess the risk of non-conformance against the principles and criteria of Standard 1 when deciding which feedstock to source for biomass production. This is done by using Standard 2, which will allow to identify, evaluate, and manage the risks of sourcing feedstock that present the risk of not complying with criteria in Standard 1. So Standard 1 includes the legality and sustainability criteria, and Standard 2 describes the verification process. For the first time, we also have developed and published comprehensive guidance document for Standard 1. We definitely recommend to study this requirement. It's many pages of explaining how to understand, how to implement the indicators. Let's look at the high-level structure of the Standard 1. We have 4 principles. The most exciting principle is 3, about forest carbon. This is where we differentiate from other schemes like FSC and PFC. We have 8 criteria underneath 4 principles, and there is total 42 indicators altogether. So as I said, in this presentation, we will not go through all 42 indicators. Please go to the online modules for Standard 1 and also read the guidance. You will have a lot of detailed information about each of the indicators. So let's give you some highlights. In principle 1, the legality requirements were streamlined, making sure our standards comply with regulatory requirements of the biomass end user markets where certificate holders do business was and is a prerequisite. The HCV biodiversity productivity indicators were separated into the standalone principle 2. Remember, in the version 1 of the Standard 1, we had 2 principles. Principle 1 was for legality and principle 2 was for sustainability. And principle 2 covered environmental, social, and forest carbon requirements. So now we split them into separate principles. And principle 2 talks about HCV environmental requirements. So we have significantly strengthened the environmental requirements with addition of the need to identify threats to ecosystems and maintain or enhance key species, habitats, ecosystems, and areas of high conservation value. No-go areas of land that cannot be changed or converted have been clarified as forest, wetland, peatland, and highly biodiverse grassland. Forested land must be regenerated. We also included that agrochemicals that are harmful to people and the environment must be banned, cannot be used. Of course, we have indicators for soil protection, waste management, removal of harvest residues, protection of water resources, air emission control, sustainability of harvesting levels, control of natural processes, and use of GMOs. So you might say, like all these things were included in the version 1 of the standard. However, we revised wording of all the indicators, make them clearer, and in some parts we made them also stricter and more more efficient. Then forest carbon LULUCF indicators, they moved under standalone principle 3. Management of forest carbon has been introduced as a new principle. So previously there was just a criterion in principle 2. Now we have a standalone principle 3. Land use change, and forestry LULUCF requirements have been added to be compatible with RED 2. Then we have some requirements about the need to ensure that forest carbon is stable or increasing in the forest, in the supply base. No primary feedstock harvesting is allowed in low productivity or difficult to regenerate areas, and also not in the areas combining high conservation value and high carbon stock properties. Also, we introduced cascading use principle, which prohibits the use of high quality stem wood if it is in substantial demand for long-lived products in the supply base. There is a lot of things to learn through the practice, through implementation of the new requirements. We will definitely need to provide additional training, perhaps guidance. We will learn from CBs, from certificate holders, how this requirement is going to be implemented. But we believe that implementation of the requirements in the revised principle 3 will be most interesting and will require additional effort in the implementation by biomass producers. Then in principle 4, standard has improved significantly with new and enhanced social requirements. So some of the key highlights are that we added fighting discrimination through strengthening protection of worker and their rights. Then certificate holder responsibilities towards local communities are now recognized. There is a requirement to identify and avoid negative impact on the local communities. Requirements have been added to protect those areas which communities access their basic needs, to fulfill their basic needs, and to protect cultural heritage sites. The rights of indigenous people are protected through implementation of FPIC or consultation and accommodation process. So again, we feel that the whole principle has been restructured and significantly strengthened. Standard 1 has also been complemented with a special ID document to cover trees outside forest. We believe that this significantly improves the clarity around the application of the SBP scheme to the TOF, so-called TOF, trees outside forest. So it's like a woody biomass or feedstock which is sourced from outside forest, from agricultural lands, from the landscape, from some infrastructure along the roads, under the power lines, and things like this. So as I said already, you will find detailed explanation for each indicator in full online module available online on our YouTube channel. But again, in short, I would argue that those of you who have used standard 1 before will find new standard not very still quite familiar, and you will definitely benefit from a better structure and better wording of the requirements. So standard 2 is probably the core standard in the whole framework, so to say, our scheme's engine. Certification scheme applies risk-based approach, where biomass producers assess the risk of non-compliance against the principles and criteria of standard 1 when deciding which feedstock to source for biomass production. So using this standard, biomass producers will identify, evaluate, and adequately manage the risks of sourcing feedstock where there is a risk not to comply with criteria in standard 1. Risks are still rated as low or specified, so no changes here. Organizations need to ensure that all specified risks are managed and reduced to low level or otherwise exclude this feedstock from their sourcing. So organizations gain certification against standard 2 by complying with the requirements set in standard 1 and demonstrating that they have adequately reduced the risk of sourcing feedstock that is not in compliance with standard 2. So again, it all means that standard 1 and 2, they work closely together. Standard 1 cannot be used on its own. It just includes a criteria of legality and sustainability, and standard 2 defines the verification process. There is also special requirements in Standard 2 for processing residues and post-consumer feedstock. So I will get to that as well. So here we will discuss the key components of Standard 2. Again, it's a short version of the presentation. Obviously, there is a whole online presentation on Standard 2 online, which you should watch separately. But here we will just have a recap and focus on a couple of very critical topics. So Standard outlines the necessary steps for organizations to properly evaluate and manage potential risks associated with sourcing biomass feedstock. The structure has slightly changed compared to version 1, and the requirements have been rewritten. So section 1 here, it's about supply base definition and mapping. Component, this requires organizations to define and map their supply base, identifying specific sources and locations of biomass feedstock. I would argue that in principle, this hasn't changed compared to version 1, except that we improved the wording. Traceability to the supply base, it's the second section. Organizations must implement a traceability system that tracks biomass feedstock from the supply base to the biomass producer. So it's a supply chain traceability. Then the first 2 sections is about defining the origin of the feedstock and tracing it back to the origin. Section 3 is supply base evaluation. A thorough evaluation of supply base is required to identify potential sustainability risks of violating Standard 1 requirements. So section 3 has table to understand whether a supply base evaluation is applicable and to which extent, and we will look at this in the next slide. Section 4 is supply base reporting. Organizations are expected to report on their supply base. They need to use audit portal to prepare a so-called supply base report. So in this regard, no changes. We use audit portal for quite some time already, and the structure of the supply base report is currently being improved. So the structure will change, and hopefully it will be simpler and will provide probably much better information for stakeholders. Section 5 is supply base verifiers. Independent verifiers are used to validate the accuracy and reliability of organizations' risk assessment and management efforts. This to be used when the regional risk assessment is not available. In the next slides, I will explain the difference between the risk assessment and regional risk assessment. Section 6 is about risk assessment. So organizations where there is no regional risk assessment, official one available, they need to develop their own risk assessment, define risk ratings, low or specified. So in principle, no changes here. Section 6 is or 7 is risk management. Based on the findings of the risk assessment, organizations must develop and implement a risk management plan to mitigate identified risks. So any risks which cannot be rated as low, they need to be mitigated or managed. The section 8 is stakeholder engagement. Engagement with stakeholders is a crucial aspect of risk management. Requirements for stakeholder engagement have not really changed. So the requirements are more or less similar, that the biomass producer needs to develop their supply base evaluation, and they need to share it with the relevant stakeholders at least 30 days before finalization of the supply base evaluation report. And yeah, so in these terms, no changes really happened. Annex 1 is about processing residues and post-consumer feedstock. So we have this as a new annex. I think it previously was as an instruction note. Now it's Annex 1. This component addresses the specific requirements and considerations for organizations sourcing biomass from processing residues and post-consumer materials. In short, in order to use the benefits of these 2 feedstock categories, the biomass producer shall credibly demonstrate that feedstock indeed belongs to these categories. The benefits of this categorization include full recognition of benchmark claims for processing residues, and direct compliance for post-consumer material. I will talk about this in the next slide. What does it actually mean? So again, looking at what we should cover today, I decided that today we should spend a few minutes on section 7 of the standard 2. This section includes requirements for the supplier base evaluation. It's very important to understand when supplier base evaluation is applicable and to which extent. In this section, we have quite significant changes compared to the version 1 of the standard. So organizations, they must review indicator 3.2 of standard 2 to determine if they are required to maintain their supply base evaluation or not, considering two aspects. One is their feedstock types, and second is certification status. So feedstock types are primary feedstock, processing residues feedstock, and post-consumer feedstock. Certification status is certified or non-certified, and in case of certified, whether that certification is a benchmarked or recognized scheme. The illustration on the right is taken from the draft SBP benchmarking methodology and should help you visualize, understand this decision-making process. So let's look at those three types of feedstock and how this decision is being made. In case of primary feedstock, supplier-based evaluation is always required. This is a big change compared to the current standard, where we had this green lane for FSC and PFC feedstocks. This is not anymore available for primary feedstock. However, sourcing primary feedstock with the claim of so-called SBP benchmark scheme, for example, FSC, may help to manage risks. Another important aspect is that there are two types of risk assessment: SBP endorsed RRA and company-owned risk assessment. As I promised, in the next slide, I will cover this in details. So to recap, for primary feedstock, supply-based evaluation is always required. Sourcing material with FSC or PFC claim can help to manage risks. For processing residues, so the next feedstock category, the first step is to demonstrate that feedstock really belongs to the processing residues category. And then it depends whether feedstock is certified against one of the SBP recognized schemes. I can give you a teaser that those schemes will be FSC, PFC, and SFI. So if it is certified, then feedstock is accepted as SBP compliant. If not, then the BP needs to implement the whole supply base evaluation in the same way as they do it for the primary feedstock. So if your organization used to source only FSC or PFC processing residues feedstock, then I would argue that in these terms, in relation to standard 2, nothing will really change. So you will be able to use those claims. You still need to, of course, to demonstrate that this material belongs to processing residues category, but then it can be transformed into the SBP compliant material. Then the third one is a post-consumer feedstock or recycled, or like old pallets, old furniture, old demolished buildings, and things like this. So the biomass producer shall follow the requirements of Annex 1 of Standard 2 and demonstrate that the feedstock category is indeed post-consumer. In this case, the feedstock may be considered SBP compliant directly. So that's again, like I'm not aware of such companies, but if there would be a company who would be just sourcing post-consumer feedstock, they would not need to do supply-based evaluation. They would not need to source it as certified. All they would need to do is to demonstrate that this belongs to post-consumer category. Finally, SBP recognizes FSC and PFC controlled system claims and allows them to be used for SBP controlled biomass. So supply-based evaluation is not required in this case. So basically, the BP is sourcing FSC or PFC controlled feedstock and can produce SBP controlled biomass from it. We are currently also exploring the scheme as SFI fiber sourcing. We believe that it will also potentially qualify for SBP compliant biomass. We need to do some additional research, and there are some specific elements But we will probably include this information in our final benchmarking methodology and reports, and most likely SFI will also be covered. Important to note here is that you can always decide to still apply supply-based evaluation and to, so to say, upgrade controlled claim to the compliant claim. So you can do your kind of, you may say like, okay, I source it with the controlled claim. My customers are not satisfied with SBP controlled biomass claim. So like I would like to upgrade it and implement supply-based evaluation. That's always an option. So again, like I repeat myself, but I would like to again to still repeat it and recap, is that the biggest change is that there is no green lane for FSC and PFC certified primary feedstock. And these claims only serve as potential risk management measure. For processing residues and post-consumer feedstock, changes are not really not substantial, if any at all. All right, as I promised in the previous slide, let's explain the difference between using RRA and biomass producer's own risk assessment. So let's assume that supply-based evaluation is necessary. The biomass producer is using primary feedstock. So we should look at the components of the SBE and when do these apply. On this slide, you can see the table. It has 3 columns. The first column is SBE elements. Second is column for company's own risk assessment, and the third column is for SBP endorsed regional risk assessment. So SBP endorsed regional risk assessment is similar to FSC national or centralized national controlled wood risk assessment. So it is something which is provided by SBP scheme to the biomass producers, to the market, and everyone sourcing from this region needs to use it. So it's official risk assessment, which everyone needs to use. Currently, we have such risk assessments for Baltics, for Denmark, for 2 provinces in Canada, and there are a few additional regions are being under development now. So looking at this, the components of supply-based evaluation include supply-based verifiers, risk assessment, risk rating, risk management plan, and risk management measures. So when we have regional risk assessment in place, then the first 3 are not necessary. So organization doesn't need to do risk assessment, doesn't need to rate the risk into low or specified. This job is already done and provided by the SBP. However, like one major region today is United States, where we don't have regional risk assessment, and this is where companies would need to do their own. Other region would be Vietnam or Malaysia, where again, the company risk assessment would be necessary. The supply-based verifiers identify information needed in the form of evidence or means of verification that are appropriate to specific supply base and which allow the risks of negative impact to be assessed. So in simple words, it means that our indicators in standard 1, they are global, they are universal. So they cannot always be easily applied directly. That's why the biomass producer needs to define supply-based verifiers, which is usually legislation, some online platforms, maybe some mechanism for consulting experts and stakeholders to actually apply, or kind of how do you get evidence or get information to assess those specific indicators. And for every region, these supply-based verifiers will be different. But as I said, if you use regional risk assessment, then this job is already done by SBP, and all you need to do is to go through the risk assessment, find specified risks, and then implement risk management plan and risk management measures. So the risk management plan contains 1 or more risk management measures. So like the plan is like basically a sum of all measures. It's a kind of a process of managing the risks, and risk management measure is like a specific measure for each indicator. So here we explain the difference, and yeah, we see currently many key regions are covered by the regional risk assessment. However, some of the regions are not, and this is where we are going to work. I mean, one of our priorities is obviously to develop more regional risk assessments. I would also like to say a few words about benchmarking. So this is a new concept in Standard 2, and we're still in the process of finalizing the methodology as well as benchmarking reports for FSC and PFC schemes. As we learned from the previous slides, there is no green lane for FSC and PFC. In case of primary feedstock, both certification schemes are still very much aligned with SBP Standard 1 requirements, and benchmarking reports show where the remaining gaps are. So the whole process, the whole exercise was to help biomass producers who source certified feedstock to simplify their supply base evaluation and risk management process, and show where those other scheme claims can be used as effective risk management measure, which result in not managing the risk otherwise. So all the management would be limited to sourcing this claim. A few words about methodology, just as a background. The methodology covers operational and performance requirements. Operational requirements include the scheme structure, processes, oversight. This part is not relevant for certificate holders and is taken care by SBP. So like what we mean here is that when assessing benchmarking other schemes, we try to look at the organizations, like including that those FSC and PFC schemes they are credible, they are well known, they are well established, they have very strong structure, they have all the transparency mechanisms, they have very strong accreditation mechanisms, and so on. So like we looked at the schemes from the operational perspective, and this is not something what is it's just for background information. The biomass producers don't need to use this information in their daily work. What is important for them is performance requirements. So performance requirements are the legality and sustainability requirements of Standard 1, and benchmarking report shows to what extent Standard 1 requirements are covered by the respective scheme. So requirements may be covered fully, partially, or not covered at all. So in the benchmarking report, you will see for each indicator, there will be yes, no, or partial. If requirements are covered, marked as yes, the sourcing feedstock with this claim may serve as a good risk management measure. Partial or no require implementation of risk management measures, where partial shows that certification scheme covers SBP requirements to some extent, but not fully. So that's kind of very helpful instrument. It's currently in the phase of finalization. We assume or we expect that the methodology and FSC and PFC benchmarking reports should be ready by the effective date of 10th of August. So as soon as these are finalized, we will publish it on our website and inform all stakeholders. Please also note that benchmarking process is not applicable to RED 2 technical scope. FSC and PFC schemes are not recognized by European Commission for RED 2, and thus SBP couldn't formally include them as a risk management measure under RED 2. We are aware that PFC is in the process of getting recognized, but it's not yet clear how long it will take. And of course, once it is recognized, then we will reconsider and see how it could work for our RED 2 implementation. And frankly, thinking about this more, it can become very helpful because PFC already meeting a lot of requirements for our Standard 1, and if it would be also recognized by the European Commission for RED 2, that would be very useful. So like we cannot formally include it in our benchmarking process for RED 2. However, the market has an experience with EUTR regulation, and where FSC and PFC claims are not formally recognized, it's not written anywhere that these have green lane or are listed as a potential mitigation measures, but they are still widely used by operators for risk management. So here, the scheme, the SBP, we cannot include it in our benchmarking processes, but we assume or expect that the market, the biomass producers, will still use FSC and PFC claims when they address the risks related to RED 2. So yeah, so that will be, it will not be probably limited to only sourcing FSC and PFC, but we believe that claims of those systems can also be used for RED 2, but we cannot formally recognize them when we cannot formally include it in our normative framework. Benchmarking reports are not yet finalized, but I will give you some draft results. Please note that these results are draft and may change after the technical review. So preliminary reports show that FSC scheme has gaps for 7 indicators and PFC has gaps for 9 indicators. Gaps means that it's either marked as no or partial. These gaps include topics like HCV, non-conversion, forest carbon, and social requirements. It doesn't necessarily mean that schemes ignore those topics, but sometimes wording is not exactly the same or our indicators are not covered fully. So this is very important element of this SBP system requirements. Biomass producers who source FSC and PFC primary feedstock, they will not be able to use those claims directly for compliance, but they can significantly simplify their risk management. So if we remember that there are 42 indicators in total, and in FSC case, it's 7 indicators which are gaps, and for PFC, it's 9. Again, preliminary numbers, don't take them as final, which means that there is only a certain amount of effort which needs to be done to mitigate those remaining risks. And using this benchmarking mechanism significantly support biomass producers. We are also planning additional training and guidance on how to use benchmark schemes in supply-based evaluation, and we believe that we will be able to do this shortly after benchmarking reports are finalized. All right, so we covered standard 1 and standard 2, and let's move to the next standard, standard 3. It's less known standard for certificate holders. It is used by certification bodies and accreditation body. A revised version of the standard has strengthened the auditor and peer reviewer competency requirements. It also has definition of non-conformances which are aligned with best practices. It has greater clarity on the checks conducted during the annual surveillance audits. It has a clearer timeliness for certification body to perform certain tasks. The revised standard also introduces updates on audit planning and sampling. We are planning separate sessions for certification bodies, accreditation body, and peer reviewers in the second half of June. These sessions will be only open to those actors. This will not be open to certificate holders. So I will not spend too much time today looking into the standard 3. I believe that this standard hasn't changed much compared to the previous version. I believe that certification bodies are in a very good position to transition to the new standard relatively easily. Subjectively, our team thinks that this kind of probably the most minor changes happen to standard 3 compared to the version 1. CBs may of course disagree with me. There are some additional burden, but I would say, like in general, the requirements remain significantly the same, with some clarification, with some interpretation being moved into the standard itself. And yeah, I would argue that we have like the least worry about CB's transition into the revised standard 3. I think it should not create any problems. So perhaps the key significant change is the evaluation planning. The CB shall have documented sampling procedure, consider intensity, scale, and risk. There are improved requirements regarding auditing of temporary and permanent sites. And then there is also improved requirements when CB certification body is doing evaluation of risk ratings and risk management measures. So when it takes place at the FMU or supplier level, we introduced a sampling formula, which is always not most ideal solution because each supplier-based evaluation and sourcing process is different. However, leaving it absolutely open and flexible was also not a good outcome, because that would result in potentially different level of effort by different certification bodies, and we really were looking for establishing a baseline to harmonize the level of effort necessary for the field work. Another thing which I would like to also mention here is that working with stakeholders has also slightly changed. we believe that we improved stakeholder consultation requirements for CBs. So previously, certification body was required to conduct a formal public stakeholder consultation 30 days prior to the assessment. Usually it was done by sending emails to relevant stakeholders. This process wasn't very effective and could result in stakeholder fatigue. Standard 2 applies a smarter approach, or Standard 3 version 2 applies a smarter approach to the verification of stakeholder engagement. So firstly, we are asking certification bodies to inform SBP Secretariat about initial evaluations and re-evaluations, regardless if they have supply-based evaluation in the scope or not. And the certification body shall provide information to SBP at least 1 month prior to the start of the evaluation, which is the names and location of the entity, scheduled date, which can be preliminary because sometimes it's hard to so much in advance to have a specific date, but it needs to be an approximate date, but quite well fixed. And then contact details for both the company and the certification body to facilitate comments from stakeholders. So it basically means that 1 month before starting the assessment, information will be published on SBP website, and stakeholders can then visit our website, and if they are interested, if they are following specific certification bodies, certificate holder, they can submit comments. They can submit comments to SBP or certification body directly. We are basically fixing the problem where if certification body is operated in a region where they have 10, 20, 30 biomass producers certified, they potentially need to send tens of emails to the same stakeholders, same NGOs, for example, over the year. And that's obviously not very helpful. People hate to receive similar emails in such a big amount, and obviously they wouldn't have resources to respond to each of the email. So I'm not saying this new solution is ideal again, but it's significant improvement. And we are probably moving towards some kind of stakeholder engagement platform run by SBP, where it will be done in a much more efficient and modern way than just sending those emails, which often end up in the spam box and is never responded. The certification body also need, of course, to check the stakeholder engagement plan by the certificate holder and evaluate it prior to the audit. Let's move to the next standard, Standard 4. So, as before, Standard 4 sets the requirements for organizations along the supply chain, what they must follow to trace and account for purchases of SBP compliant and controlled feedstock and biomass. Previously, in version 1, we relied heavily on chain of custody requirements of FSC and PFC. Standard 4 version 1 was very short, so it was almost only saying that you need to apply chain of custody requirements of FSC or PFC standards, which was not very optimal, obviously, for a number of reasons, including the challenges with following the changes in other system requirements, defining applicable requirements where FSC and PFC cover much more types of products than just biomass, and many requirements were not relevant for sustainable biomass, and also FSC and PFC systems were not compatible with mass balance rules of RED 2. So, considering this all, the decision has been made to develop a self-sufficient SBP chain of custody standard, which is now longer than the previous standard version 1, but is significantly shorter than a standalone FSC chain of custody or PFC chain of custody standard. Both FSC and PFC chain of custody standards were used still for inspiration, and many relevant useful requirements were included. Important change is also that Standard 4 version 2 doesn't require certificate holder to be certified against previously called SBP approved chain of custody system. So in other words, holding FSC or PFC or SFI chain of custody certificate is not mandatory anymore. So the key highlights is probably that SBP has adopted the traceability concept of mass balance, known from RED 2, which accounts for certified volumes purchased and sold. Other key changes are stakeholder engagement plan requirements, business integrity, product groups, Yeah, so let's check those key changes in the few slides. So we have new requirement for stakeholder engagement, which includes identification of stakeholders and creating the stakeholder engagement plan. As defined in the glossary, a stakeholder engagement plan is a procedure that outlines how and when relevant stakeholders will be identified and contacted, what information will be shared with them, and how comments, feedback will be received, reviewed, addressed, and responded to. The intention of the stakeholder engagement is to demonstrate a commitment of being open, transparent, and responsible with regards to conformance with the SBP requirements. In simple terms, the certificate holder needs to ensure that it has no negative impact on the surroundings and that it is good neighbor and partner. It is applicable to all certificate holders, regardless whether they have a supply-based evaluation in the scope or not. So also the biomass producers without SBE, or a trader in a harbor, or even trader without physical possession would need to have some kind of stakeholder engagement plan. The complaint procedure is part of this plan and is conventional practice for our organizations to implement certification. This area is new, so we will probably learn from practicing this. Our desire or our objective of this requirement was that previously stakeholder engagement was only limited to sourcing of feedstock, and things happening around the, for example, biomass producers plant were not addressed. This engagement with those stakeholders who are impacted by the operation of the plant itself. So this wasn't covered previously, but now covered through this requirement. Next is the business integrity. These requirements are not totally new, and but these have been strengthened. So first of all, we have requirements for legality, anti-corruption, and health and safety. Organizations should complete a self-assessment against these requirements for its own operations. And another new requirement is a self-assessment and statement against social requirements listed in Standard 1 Criterion 4.1. So remember, from Standard 1, this applies to feedstock. So it's about rights of workers and how the organization treating its workers. So we feel that it's very important to apply same principles, not only for the sourcing of feedstock at the level maybe of the forest, but also at the level of the biomass plant itself or the level of the harbor operation. Yeah, so in the guidance document, you will find more information about how to implement it, some examples, guidance for the self-assessment process, and so on. Next, let's have a quick look on the mixing options. The intent of this requirement is to ensure that feedstock is not physically mixed with non-SBP feedstock, so that requirement remains the same. SBP allows mixing of SBP compliant and controlled feedstock. If any non-SBP feedstock is mixed with compliant or controlled feedstock, then the entire mix loses its SBP status. When compliant feedstock is mixed with controlled feedstock, the proportionate method shall be applied. Alternatively, the whole mix can be downgraded and classified as controlled. The certified biomass shall not be mixed with non-SBP certified biomass at any point after biomass production. So it means that if you are a trader in a harbor and you receive SBP compliant or controlled pellets, and then you also receive FSC certified pellets or PFC certified pellets, you cannot mix them physically. If you mix them physically, then you lose the status of certification. So SBP compliant and SBP controlled biomass may also be mixed with non-woody biomass. So in this case, the amount of SBP certified biomass shall be proportionate to eligible input. So this can be mixed physically, they can be sold together, but on the invoice, the SBP compliant or controlled woody biomass pellets shall be shown separately. Next, before we check example of the mass balance, we need to say a couple of words about product groups. So it's a new concept. It was introduced in the version 2 of the standard 4. So in standard 4 version 1, or actually it was in ID5E document, we had a concept of dynamic batch sustainability data, or DBSD. The DBSD is used for controlling Dutch SDE plus claims and categories. So since DBSD was only used for Dutch claims, then some of the data was dynamic for some markets, like for example, SDE plus category 5 or Flanders restricted claims, but then was static for others. SBP standard version 2 introduces the change that sustainability data is dynamic for all transactions. So to achieve that, and when the organization is a biomass producer, it shall categorize product type, wood chips and pellets, into product groups for the purpose of mass balancing and controlling claims. So as a minimum, the biomass producer shall create separate product groups for each product type. So if they sell both pellets and wood chips, they would need to have separate product groups and separate mass balances for this, and assign unique 2-digit product group ID under the following feedstock classification rules. So we have 5 categories, like forest feedstock, trees outside forest, urban and landscape, trees outside forest, agriculture, land, processing residues, and post-consumer feedstock. Obviously, most likely, companies will not use all 5 of them. So I can see that in North American regions, trees outside forests are not very much used. Post-consumer feedstock is also not that used. So most likely, most companies will use forest feedstock and then processing residues feedstock. However, in Europe, trees outside the forest may constitute a significant share of the incoming feedstock as well. So such approach allows sustainability data to be dynamic with every transaction. So if end user receives a transaction with product group ID 4A, it knows that the corresponding amount of pellets was deducted from the mass balance account for processing residues feedstock. The data in the SAR report only complements it with specific details on feedstock origin, shape, moisture content, transport distances, and so on. So how data is communicated and how product group ID is used in communicating data through the supply chain, we will talk about this in a few moments under standard 5 and ID document 5E. Before that, we just need to cover the product group concept in general and also have a look at the mass balance requirements. You may also ask, like, what letter A means. So there may be a decision to categorize biomass into additional product groups. It is optional, and in most cases, the biomass producer would choose to do this only of a specific claim or reporting requirement of the regulatory market for where biomass is being sold to. So like if there are some restrictions on the type of feedstock, different origins, maybe someone wants to provide data from mass balancing on the country of origin, maybe they want to exclude some countries, maybe exclude some types of feedstock. So it's open. We don't yet know how it will be used, how much the companies will implement this additional product group categorization, but this is possible, and then the production batch ID will be affected by this change. So a unique product group ID shall be assigned to each product group per table here. If only minimum mandatory level product group is used, then the product group ID, the number instead of A shall be used to 0. So for forest feedstock, we would have number 10. For processing residues, we would have number 40, and so on. Each additional voluntary characteristic shall have separate unique A digit. So if you want to have mass balance for United States and Canada separately, I don't know how useful is that requirement, but for example, then you could have one ID 11 and second ID 12. So you could have still forest feedstock, but then you would split them into 2 separate categories. As I said, this information, this functionality is optional, and it's yet to be seen how it's going to be used by the companies. Last topic to discuss is about mass balance. On this slide, we see a simple illustration of mass balance. There's a request just to talk about this a little bit in more details. So let's look at the example. The time period chosen here is 3 months. It is dictated by the RED II mass balance rules that limit it to 3 months when feedstock is not only primary feedstock. Conversion factor. So later I will talk about the mandatory status of RED II, and let me come back to this 3 months versus 12 months. Conversion factor is taken 1-to-1, just to simplicity. Imagine, just obviously it's different in real life, but let it be 1-to-1. On the left, we see feedstock inputs divided by feedstock category. So again, how likely is this situation? But we can imagine that this is a biomass pellet plant somewhere in Europe, maybe in Baltics, who source forest feedstock. They also source tough agriculture. Maybe there is some biomass collected from agricultural fields, and they also source processing residues. They source wood chip sawdust from sawmills, for example. Then they have like a 3 months period during which they record how much the quantity of received of the material is SBP compliant. So of course, here under mass balance, we are not talking about SBE. SBE is standard 2. We assume that supply-based evaluation has been implemented for primary feedstock, and we can kind of assume that material is SBP compliant. So yeah, if there was also like some kind of physical inventory before September, then it can also be taken into the mass balance calculation. In our example here, we don't illustrate that, but we have here that during the 3 months period, they received different types of feedstock, 100, 200, 300 tons. It could be that there was also some stock inventory at the end of August, for example. So then this physical material could also be added to the mass balance calculation, and it would need to be then defined to which product group ID it belongs. For the sake of this example, let's imagine that the biomass producer has sold 300 tons of processing residues and 200 tons of tough agricultural biomass pellets to their customers. Imagine there were several different customers. So at the end of the period, they have physical stock of 100 tons. And since they have spent their mass balance for processing residues and tough, then this remaining 100 tons would need to be moved into the next period as forest feedstock pellets. If biomass producer has the need to sell a big quantity of processing residues pellets, more than they usually source during the 3 months period, they will need to accumulate this not just as a mass balance virtually, but also as a sufficient physical stock. So you can see here that all together they have 600, or altogether they have here 300 tons of processing residues. Imagine there is an order and there is a vessel to ship, like they need to put 1,000 tons. That means that they need to keep the physical material in stock for several months potentially. Maybe they need to keep it in the harbor, but it's not anymore possible to move or kind of to register this product group as virtual credits. So the key difference with the credit-based system is that the virtual credits are detached were detached from the physical stock, but the mass balance system are much more linked to the physical stock. In coming week or two, we are going to also publish a normative interpretation to provide instructions on how to transition from the credit-based system of FSC and PFC to the mass balance system. The text of the interpretation is almost ready, and this is gonna be published either next week or a week after, I think. So that will basically explain that when you are using standard 1 today and you have your credit system and you may have some credits available, and sometimes you have credits exceeding the physical inventory, then we are going to publish rules how these virtual credits, to what extent this can be used in the mass balance system. Yeah. So let's go to the next standard, which is standard 5. So standard 5 sets requirements for recording and communicating accurate data to allow calculation of greenhouse gas emissions. Key technical details for data collection and communication are described in a separate ID document 5E. So standard 5 together with this ID 5E define the requirements and options for collecting energy and carbon data to accompany SBP certified biomass through the supply chain. We decided not to change the numbering, so we keep this ID 5E. We don't start from 1, but since everyone is familiar and used to this number, we decided to keep it. The key tools remain the same, SAR report and SREG, and SBP Standard 5 is supported by DTS, where whole data collection and recording is now integrated into the DTS system. So we already know that SBP Standard 5 allows biomass producers and traders to collect and communicate all necessary data for greenhouse gas calculations. The key concepts used previously in standard version 1 have not changed. The biomass producer trader creates a sales transaction in DTS. Transaction record includes usual information like invoice tonnage, invoice data, number, product type, SBP claim, compliant or controlled. Other major certification systems like FSC and PFC, they require the same information already, with the difference that in SBP scheme, we need to transmit this information using the DTS platform. Where it gets interesting is that SBP requires more information to be attached to the transaction, as you know. So additional mandatory information is production batch, downstream transport route, and when necessary, SREG. Next, we will review 2 key changes. So new form for the production batch ID and new concepts like DTR and product group ID. So production batch ID is a mechanism to attach relevant data to the sales transaction. It has changed compared to the previous version. On the right side, on this gray box, we see the old PBID format or version 1. There is a difference in the order of data included here, and the PBID didn't include dynamic sustainability data in full format, but only for the default number 99. So like if you had this number 99, you would need to separately look for the DBSD section, and DBSD section in DTS would only cover SD plus claims and Flanders claims. So yeah, so kind of now the data in the new format, it will also carry the product group data and will be the dynamic for all the transactions. So on the left, we have a new format, and new format includes the certificate number, CB accreditation number, so this don't change, reporting period number, so this number is to link to the valid SAR report. And then we have a new thing, which is product group ID. We already covered product group ID and the standard 4, so we know that now it's the production batch ID also communicate the product group, and it also then directly linked to the mass balance. And then downstream transport route. So you can imagine that, let's say there is an end user, they buy 1,000 tons of pellets with the compliant claim, transaction comes through DTS, it includes production batch ID, and the production batch ID attached to this transaction provides information about biomass producer via the reference SAR report and the transportation route. So the critical data allows to do the greenhouse gas emission calculation and reporting to regulators. So downstream transport route ID replaces the term SDE plus in the version 1 of the standard. So previously, remember, SDE was, or SDE is basically static data identifier. Sometimes it was also called scope endpoint. Now we change it to another term, which is transport route ID. So downstream transport route ID, DTR. Let's see, after some time, people probably start using this abbreviation, DTR. So another difference is that DTR does not change across the reporting period. You remember previously, every time you complete the SAR, you had to start writing or counting those SDIs again, and sometimes the companies who had many SDIs, they would need to use kind of over 100, and then like the number was quite significant. So since we have a new reference to the reporting period, then we decided that the DTR, if it doesn't change, it can remain the same. So if the pellet mill sells through 2 harbors and from their gate sometime, then they can have 3 DTRs, and these 3 DTRs will be 01, 02, 03, and this won't change over this reporting period. This can stay the same. Important clarification here is that product group and feedstock data is still partly historic, in a sense that the mass balance is updated in live regime, but the data about feedstock properties like moisture content, shape or transport distances, as well as the data about energy and fuel use of the biomass producer is coming from 12 months reporting period preceding the audit closing meeting. So when you're receiving production batch ID, you have real data about the product group, you have real data about so you know that this product group has been deducted from the respective mass balance. You have data about downstream transport route, but data about the feedstock characteristics is still historic. So you need to, through the SAR reporting reference, you need to open the SAR report, which covers the historic previous period, and which of course is not real live data, real-time data, is like slightly historic data. This is that our working group has discussed and agreed that this is the only feasible option to implement these requirements. The SAR report remains more or less the same. Some new fields added like product group ID, DTR, stock inventory, and so on. So we will be publishing revised ID5E and SAR report shortly. And yeah, from the beginning of this year, we moved SAR report into the DTS. So that will hopefully facilitate working with the SAR report, making it easier to validate calculations and so on. Finally, standard 6, I will just spend 1 minute here. Standard 6 is solely focused on the calculation of greenhouse gas emissions. All requirements fit on just 1 page. All the actual requirements are included in separate instruction documents. At this stage, standard 6 remains optional for end users. So far, no certificate holders use it, but we assume or expect that this may change in the future. And our team will start working on designing additional tools for audit reporting when standard 6 is used. And also we are working on the so-called greenhouse gas calculator. So like eventually what we want to achieve is that since all the data is already in the audit portal or DTS, we have SAR data in DTS, we have all the transactions there. So in theory, we should be able to implement greenhouse gas calculator. So all this digital data goes directly into the calculator, and end user can press few buttons and receive their emissions calculations in the end. So that will probably still take some time for us. So stay tuned for the updates. As I explained, standard 6 doesn't work alone. It works with the instruction documents. Currently, one available document is instruction document 6D. It's optional. It includes RED 2 methodology for greenhouse gas calculations. It's normative, can be used by certificate holders to do their calculations and by certification bodies to certify those calculations. So as there will be more interest and this standard will start to be used, we are planning to develop a detailed training and some additional guidance and instructions on this particular instruction document and standard 6. Let me also quickly mention a few other developments. First of all, I would like to emphasize again that in line with the decision made by the Standards Committee, EU RED 2 compliance has been included in SBP certification requirements, and this is now mandatory. So basically, when you transfer to the new standard, SBP Standards version 2, using SBP RED 2 bridging document becomes mandatory. Now it's optional. I know that some companies started extending their scope to include bridging document from version 2 of SBP standards. Using bridging document will be required, and every time SBP compliant or controlled claim is being made, it will also need to be accompanied by the SBP RED 2 compliant claim. We are working with the European Commission on updating RED 2 bridging document to better link it to the new standards. We also including integrating some updates from implementing regulations from RED 2, and our analysis shows that most likely there will be no significant changes for biomass producers or traders in using updated bridging ID. It will be rather better aligned with the new revised standard version 2, and most of the changes as we see them, they are related to our administration of the scheme and things related to accreditation. So again, stay tuned. We are planning in coming months to publish revised bridging ID document. What else is happening is we are working on several additional documents, as I mentioned, regional risk assessments, finalizing update of for Denmark, Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia. These are currently in the process and should be available in time. Regional risk assessments for British Columbia and Quebec are in the process of securing funding and identifying working body. So these may get slightly delayed. Again, stay tuned, and we are going to update all stakeholders on the status of that. The revised regional risk assessment will incorporate the EU RED 2 requirements related to Article 29. So when we are updating our existing risk assessments, we will also cover RED 2 requirements. So the biomass producer doesn't need to cover them separately. And before we finish with the presentation, a few words about the transition. We already covered this during the launch, so let me spend 2 minutes about transition just to remind you and give you some advice. So the revised standards will become effective on 10th of August 2023, followed by the 15-month transition period. During this period, during the period of between now or 10th of May and 10th of August, we are working on finalization of last normative documents, making different changes in DTS audit portal, providing training, providing different webinars. During the transition period, certificate holders have option to choose either to choose version 1 or 2 of the standard. But there is important thing, all certificate holders shall be compliant with version 2 of the revised standards by the end of the transition period, which is 9th of November 2024. For countries or regions with endorsed regional risk assessment, this is a condition to have a revised regional risk assessment in place. So we are currently working on Canadian RRAs. They are slightly delayed, so we will be keeping relevant stakeholders informed about the process. Those regions, other like Baltics, Denmark, are perfectly on track. Our other regions where there is no RRA available, these regions don't have any issues and will probably be able to start using new standards right after the effective date. And some recommendations for the transition. Certificate holder has its annual audit. So let me just give you some examples. The one, imagine certificate holder has annual audit in September this year. It may choose to start using version 2 of the standards already this year or do it next year. Next year, if they have audit in September against standards version 2, they should have enough time till November to finalize the reports and close them. If the certificate holder has their annual audit in November this year, then they are also, of course, may choose to use version 1 or 2, but then their 2024 next year audit, they may need to schedule for the earlier time. So they may need to speak to their certification body to bring audit to the earlier time, maybe to again October, September, August, to be able to complete everything in time by November. And then if certificate holder has their annual audit next year, like January, April, August, of course, it's very advised, very practical to start using right away version 2, because otherwise, if they have the right to use, like in April, still use version 1 for the audit, but in order to be in compliance with the transition requirements, they will need to have extra scope change audit before the end of transition to do the change from version 1 to version 2. So again, those who have, let's say, audits happening December, January, February, and so on, it is strongly recommended to start preparing and start using version 2 of the standards. So I went a little bit over time, as always, trying to give you as much information as possible. So we are done with this one-way presentation. We can move to answering questions which have been submitted. I suggest we have a 8 minutes break, and we reconvene at depending the time zone, but like we reconvene on 25 past. And basically we will go through the Q&A box, we see your questions, and we start answering them. If you have still time, you can take coffee, tea, rest, or continue submitting your questions. So see you in 7 minutes.
Thank you, Roman, and for all your presentations. So yeah, encouraging everyone to use, if it works, there is some technical issue, and we're sorry about that, the Q&A box. Otherwise, as you've seen, there's been quite some exchange already in the chat box. So we'll monitor the 2 channels to collect your questions and provide answers either as they come, or we'll take them verbally. So we resume in 7 minutes. No, yes, at 25 past. Thank you.
All right, we are back from a short break, and I was looking through the chat. I can see that there are many questions about the RRAs, regional risk assessment, and I see my colleague Laszlo, he already responded about our plans. Where are we planning more regional risk assessments? What are the status? There were questions about Latvian RRA. It's well on track. And then I guess there was also some questions about the RED 2. So I would say it like this. We have like a formal recognition for RED 2 from the Commission. The recognition is general for SBP scheme. And as you know, we have RED 2 Bridging ID, which is a sophisticated long document. The reason why it's so long is that eventually we had to include all the relevant RED 2 requirements into the separate ID document, Bridging ID document. It somehow didn't work to refer to kind of patches or paragraphs of standards 1 to 6, and the only kind of feasible option was to really include the relevant requirements in the Bridging ID. So I would argue our region of the requirements is that for the RED 2, transition from SBP standard 1 to SBP standard 2 is not relevant, because what biomass producers need to do in relation to RED 2 will not change with that. What will change is like what you need to do in relation to standard 1 or standard 2 or standard 4. I mentioned that, for example, we have a new requirement for benchmarking. We have a requirement that there is no green lane anymore for FSC and PFC claims. And we have now benchmarking process for primary feedstock, and you need to preliminary assessment shows that there are respectively 7 and 9 gaps which will need to be addressed, which need to be assessed. And out of these 7 and 9 indicators, depending on the region, it doesn't necessarily mean that all of them will be specified. So you can still be able to justify that maybe all of them are actually low risk, or maybe like half of them are low risk and the rest only maybe 3, 4 are specified. So you can imagine by source in FSC or PFC, you may end up with only up to 5 indicators which you need to mitigate. But I also mentioned that this whole exercise is not relevant for RED 2. For RED 2, we cannot apply benchmarking. For the RED 2 in the Bridging document itself, we explicitly say that recognition of FSC and PFC claims is not relevant, is not applicable. So that's why we believe that companies or potential delays with publication of the next version of the Bridging document doesn't forbid biomass producers and traders to start using SBP standards version 2. I would rather say like that today we have a situation that in the Bridging document we have a mass balance system, and then the SBP standard 4 we have a credit-based system, which creates some difficulties for biomass producers to combine two systems at the same time. When you will switch to the SBP standard 4 and other standards version 2, you will rather be more aligned with the RED 2 requirements, but the RED 2 requirements themselves, they won't change. So like we don't see like obstacles there. However, to make everything to be properly done formally, then we are still submitting documents to the guidehouse and like informing them to our contractors or the contractors used by European Commission, to inform them, to explain about the new standards, explain again that it won't actually have any impact on our RED 2 recognition, and it's basically irrelevant because the Bridging document is a self-sufficient document, including all RED 2 requirements on its own. What else in this regard? The reason why we are updating the Bridging document is also because last year 2 implementing regulations have been published, and all certification schemes were asked to update their RED 2 documentation. So we're now in the process of updating Bridging document, not because of the revised standards, but because of these 2 published regulations. I think according to our information, we have time at least till the end of this year to complete this work with those Bridging documents. Most of the requirements there are related to administration of the scheme, and they are not, in our assessment, they do not impact biomass producers, except maybe one requirement, which during the yesterday session there was a question about this 3 months versus 2 months, 12 months, 3 versus 12 months for the mass balance period. And the latest information from the Commission was that these 3 and 12 months will remain, but it will become even stricter, that 12 months will be only possible for biomass producers which use exclusively primary feedstock. So if biomass producer use both primary and processing residues feedstock, they cannot have 2 mass balance accounts calculations, one with 3 months, another with 12 months, but they will need to apply 3 months for all. It's obviously stricter. We also received feedback that this is unfortunate because there is already some companies having RED 2 in their scope, and they apply this 3 and 12 months system. However, once we have a revised Bridging ID document with stricter requirements, we will inform all the stakeholders, and there will need to be some adjustments made. This is not obviously our decision. This is the European Commission coming with the new requirements. There was also one question about traders. So the traders, if they are certified against the SBP standards version 1, and traders will only use standard 4 and they will use standard 5. So they will receive biomass with the claim, which can be SBP compliant or controlled. So then, do they actually need themselves to also change? Because like there will be a period, and this is what we are still discussing, and I think I will be able to give you the final clear answer maybe later this month during the next round of webinars on 29th and 30th of June. We will discuss it internally, but there will be a situation where at the same time the claims will be the same, SBP compliant and controlled, but the production batch ID form will be circulating old and new at the same time. So we are currently working with our IT team, with Lauri, our data manager, to see how that would work in the DTS preliminary. He says that there shouldn't be problems. And I would think that for traders since traders, they don't do SAR, they don't run mass balance, they just receive the transaction has information, production batch ID, it has the claim. Then perhaps we will need to decide like whether they need to necessarily extend their scope to receive or to the version 2 to receive biomass from the producer who already transitioned to version 2. I don't want to provide more. It's not like conclusive answer here. We will need to discuss it with our team internally, and we'll come back with the clear guidance instructions for the next round of webinars. What could be the rules? It's pretty clear that for biomass producers, if they want to use new production batch ID, want to use new SAR, they need to transition to version 2 of the standards. If they want to apply new requirements of standards 1 and 2, it's pretty clear. The biomass producer, without transitioning to version 2, cannot start using new SAR and create new production batch IDs. But for traders, it's a little bit different because their processes are much more simpler. And I see the concern that sometimes, even if the scope change audit is not very time demanding, it still requires certification body to do something remotely to assess. So I will speak to my colleagues. We have a meeting discussion, and then we'll come back with the answers. There was also one comment about the union database. We were informed that this union database is not applicable to solid biomass biofuels. So we were not required to register there. And I understand that, SBP biomass will not be covered by this union database. Let me see if there are any more questions. Or Nicholas, you have any comments?
No. Just to say we haven't received further question in the Q&A or in the chat. So we still have a few minutes. So if you have any pending comments or questions, don't hesitate to share them. Would be more than happy to discuss.
Just to, while we're waiting, just to remind that we mentioned during the launch today, I already mentioned a few minutes ago, but there will be a second round of webinars at the end of June. I think you can visit our website and see the registration information, how to attend those. It's 29th and 30th of June. And we are also planning in-person workshops in the key regions. We are going to Vietnam in August. We are going to do workshops in United States, Canada, Portugal, and Baltics in September. So during these sessions, it's going to be 1.5 days physical workshops where we're probably not going to present the same PowerPoints as we are doing here, but we will use it to respond to the locally relevant questions. So maybe questions related to the regional risk assessment, to the specific risk management measures, to specific supply chains. Again, not violating any antitrust rules, obviously, not discussing your company specific issues, but like implementation and challenges with the mass balance can be different in US, Europe, and Asia, for example. We are going to send a survey and try to collect information about what you actually would like to hear during or receive during these in-person workshops. Let me see the question, no EU database. So how to sell SBP biomass to ISCC Sure certified regarding documentation DTS. Yes, that's there is another thing which we need to settle. So the requirements, they say that we as a scheme need to recognize other voluntary schemes recognized by the European Commission, which are ISCC, SURE, and so on. So we do this recognition for the RED 2 scope, and other schemes, they do recognize us, I assume, for their RED 2 implementation. The complexity is that I think differently from other schemes, we have all these tools, as you mentioned, DTS, we have SAR, we have SREG, we have Audit Portal. No, Audit Portal may be the least relevant, but DTS and the SAR really important. So how would it be possible for us to accommodate SURE certified, ISCC certified biomass pellets into the SBP system? Currently, it looks like we won't be able to do it directly, and we have an obligation to recognize those claims for the RED 2 component. So like for SBP RED 2 compliant component claim, that's definitely possible. But since we made it mandatory that we don't have RED 2 separate technical scope, but rather every time you make RED 2 compliant claim, it also needs to be SBP compliant, so comply with standards 2 and if necessary 1. That makes it basically so our requirements, they are higher than SURE and ISCC. So we kind of recognize them for RED 2, but since they don't meet our requirements for SBP, then we don't see other possibilities that the actors in the supply chain, in order to participate in SBP system, they also need to be SBP certified. The only difference could be that if the biomass producer sources in feedstock, and the feedstock, the wood chips, for example, they come from SURE ISCC certified forest managers or groups or plantations, then in this case, I understand that the biomass producer would not need to apply RED 2 risk assessment, risk mitigation, and could, for RED 2 part, accept it as RED 2 compliant feedstock. But then it would still need to comply with SBP standard 1 and 2, do our own risk assessment, our own risk mitigation, benchmarking, all these things. So it's not very helpful because we made our system not more complicated, but we are again, I don't want to compare us to our systems. I'm just saying that we use different mechanisms. And currently, since our system is not purely RED 2 compliance, but also other requirements, then it's very difficult to connect them directly. We hear about this issue on the market, and this is something that we indeed must solve. Yeah, I hear this comment, and last week in Dublin we had a standards committee when this comment has been also made by some committee members, and we are going to explore how we can facilitate this. I don't see a possibility for fungibility that we can just easily recognize each other, because we as a scheme, we represent different things. SBP is SBP plus RED 2. So RED 2 for us, it's a like add-on. It's a technical scope, which yeah. I don't know.
We will indeed we are looking to solving that question, and as mentioned, mostly for the output. So which information we have to deliver into our system that is accessible to a trader, for example, that is selling an SBP RED 2 compliant feedstock to an ICC or SURE company, so their client being ICC or SURE certified. What kind of information ICC or SURE require to have access to demonstrate compliance of the incoming material. So that's something we need to look at with those schemes, understanding what kind of precise information needs to be available and see if that can be made available through our system. I think it's more technical, a technical solution that will be provided through the DTS, which is flexible enough to facilitate that output fungibility toward further down in the supply chain.
Yeah, that's not easy. Our scheme is not just RED 2 focused. We have, we go beyond that. That creates some additional challenges for us. But it's not that we want to be difficult. This is what our stakeholders in general want. The end users, consumers, they wanted to go beyond RED 2. This is, but you're right. I mean, there are some people who can stay at the RED 2 level, and we would like to also meet the expectations of this market, and we will explore that. I don't see any other questions so far.
No.
I understand that after the webinar, we will be sending another survey. We don't want to overload you with the surveys, but we use it as a mechanism to collect feedback and input for the next sessions. Again, if you can always provide feedback on this session, but also if there were topics which you think were not properly covered or where you want more coverage, there is a limit what we can do in 2 hours. Then we'll have 2-hour sessions in few weeks where we can go into details into other topics as well.
So as well, I've posted two key links into the chat. So if you want to have a look, as we are slowly but surely, I think, closing down this training, is the list of the access to the YouTube channel, where you will see the detailed training material recorded by Roman on all the indicators and all the revised standards. So I think it's worth taking time to, at your own pace, to listen to those webinars that potentially come with further question into the next session of training, for which I've also sent or posted the link where you can find the detailed timings, and you'll be able to register to the 2 next training that will happen at the end of June, but as well take note of the tentative date for the physical training. If you're in regions, it will be as well a great opportunity to meet you, to meet the SBP team, and to have an engaging discussion focused on local specificities as well, see how we can answers to your specific question relevant to your region. So we look very much forward to meeting you there and to continuing at supporting your transition toward version 2 of the SBP standards.
All right, thank you. Thank you everyone for participating, for questions, for listening. The recording will be available next week. And stay tuned to register for the next webinars, and we will meet again in a few weeks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, my colleagues.
Thank
Talk
you,
to
Roman.
you later. Thank you.
Speak later and have a good day all. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.